This is Group 5 for ACIT 3495, Set B, and this is our grade analysis tool. So the purpose of our project is to collect grades and store it in a MySQL database. And then we take statistics from the data in the database to calculate the lowest, the highest, and the average, and the number of grades in the database. We then take this data and store it in a MongoDB database, and show the statistics in another web app. So for
the tools that we have used for our project, we'll be using Docker to containerize our app. We use HTML and CSS for the front end and styling, Python Flask for the back end and routing. We'll use Express Node.js for the back end routing and for the authentication, MySQL to store the raw grade data, and MongoDB to store the statistical data.
So this is just a small diagram showing how our services are going to connect with each other. As we can see, a user can either access the Enter Data web app or the Show Results Python web app. Once the user enters data, or once the user enters the web app, he or she will authenticate themselves via the authentication service. Then they will be able to enter data, which would be grades in our case, into the MySQL database, which will then be pulled by the analytics service, and then converted into statistical data and placed in the Mongo database. The show results will then pull this data from the Mongo database and will be shown to authenticated users. So now let's talk about our services that we used. So our first service is the add entry service. This is usually the first service that clients will access. They'll need to use their login credentials, a username and a password, which will be then authenticated by the authentication service. Afterwards, they will be able to enter grade data, which will then be processed or put into the MySQL service. So the tools used for this service, we use Python for backend, which use Flask for routing, MySQL connector to connect to the MySQL service, and HTML and CSS for our front end.
So for authentication service, it receives requests to a specific URL, and that URL takes in the end of the URL as a parameter for a username. And if there's an associated username, it'll return the hash of that user's password so that the other services can use that to calculate whether or not someone signing in has entered in the right password. This service uses Node.js with Express.js for the API, and I use the Node Alpine image for this service.
So the next service is the MySQL service. So this service, as we said before, will store raw grade data submitted by the entry service. Afterwards, this data will be then pulled by the data analytics service to be processed into statistics such as min and max grades and average grades. This service is stateful. We did add a Docker volume to this, so even if this container gets destroyed, the volume will not. And the image used is MySQL.
So for the analytics service, it directly connects to the database to pull data from it, and it'll calculate statistics such as the highest grade, lowest grade, the average grade, and the number of grades submitted. And after processing this, it'll connect to the MongoDB database to store the data in a collection. And this Python script will run every 30 seconds to keep the data up to date. And for this, I just use Python, the MySQL connector package, and the PyMongo package. And this service uses the Python image.
So for our MongoDB service, it will store information from the data analytics service in a NoSQL database. and it is stateful. It has a Docker volume attached, and it uses the Mongo image. And lastly, for our show data service, the user has to log in, and they will be authenticated by the authentication service. It then pulls information from the MongoDB and displays it on a web page. So the tools we use is the PyMongo and Flask libraries, as well as some HTML and CSS, and it uses the Python image.
Okay. Next, we'll be doing a demonstration. So I will go into my terminal. We will run a Docker Compose up, which will run our Docker Compose file. And if we go into our Docker desktop, we can see that our containers are running. For our Docker Compose, we wait for the MySQL database to be set up before running any other Python scripts, just to make sure that every Python script is able to connect. So as we can see, once the database is set up, our Enter Data app will start to run. And once we go into localhost 5000, we can see our home page. So the first thing we need to do is sign in. This will then be authenticated by the authentication service. Then we will have a submit data page, which I will submit 80 for. And we can see the response data is submitted. And I believe Wesley can demonstrate this part afterwards. I will listen to his commands.
Yep, so now that we are trying to access the show data service, we'll have to sign in again, which will then be authenticated by the authentication service. And now it displays data from the NoSQL database as shown here.
And I believe that concludes our presentation. As we said before, we are group 5, and this is our Docker presentation. Thank you.